When a cruel woman ties a dog to a car and drives off at high speed, onlookers cannot believe what they are witnessing. People try to intervene and help the poor animal, but the woman's cruelty seems unstoppable. What happens next is not for the faint of heart. Living in a bustling city, many of the residents of Mendoza, Argentina, had witnessed some wild and crazy things in their time. But as a car screeched down the high street, everyone stood back in horror at what they were witnessing. It took a moment for people to realize just what was happening with the evil woman behind the wheel. But as soon as the situation had sunk in, people sprang into action to help the poor, defenseless animal at the heart of the cruel act. Sadly, Argentina is well known for having a large street dog population. Thankfully, over the years, many private organizations have sprung up all over the country to help protect the animals who call the streets their home. But just like anywhere else in the world, there would always be a few people who saw these poor animals as a nuisance. Recently, Molly had noticed a large brown dog hanging around her new home. When she first spotted it, the dog had looked quite skinny, as many of the street dogs often did, but in the last few weeks, the middle-aged woman had noticed the dog had started to look healthier. Molly didn't like pets, though. She had enough going on with a busy job teaching at the local high school without having an animal to look after. The more she saw the street dog, the more she became annoyed by it. She tried shooing it away, but each day when she pulled into her parking spot, the dog would be close by. Little did she know, the dog's presence was all thanks to her husband. After one particularly stressful day, Molly got out of her car and spotted the dog outside the door to her home. Anger bubbled up inside her. She had no desire to have a pet that was clean and well-behaved, let alone a filthy street dog hanging around her house. The irritated woman chased the poor dog away and attempted to throw a small stone at it to scare it. Thankfully, she missed. Slamming the door behind her, she threw her bags down and kicked off her shoes. Her husband Joe quickly came to see what all the fuss was about. Molly exploded into a rant about the street dog that had been hanging around and how she didn't want it near her home. But when her husband smiled, Molly's irritation grew as she realized her husband had been encouraging the dog to visit. Unlike Molly, Joe was a calm and pleasant man. Many people thought the couple was an odd match, given how cold and dismissive Molly often was towards her husband. In recent years, Joe had also begun to question whether he truly did love Molly. He tried his best, and there had been a time when he thought the world of her. But her attitude was becoming unbearable, and he couldn't face spending the rest of his life like that. The way she overreacted to the dog's presence only cast another shadow of doubt on their future together. Joe had first spotted the dog 2 months earlier. It had been hanging around at the bottom of the garden and looked painfully thin. The kind man had instantly taken pity on it and plated up some leftovers he found in the fridge and gave them to the dog. At first, the big dog had refused to take the food, but as soon as Joe stepped back inside, the dog hungrily tucked in. Ever since then, he'd been leaving food out for the dog, and, more recently, the dog had begun to eat with him around and even let Joe stroke him. The dog was pretty big, but the kind man instantly recognized that he was just a gentle giant. With a crumbling marriage and a wife who always seemed to shout rather than just talk, Joe began to find solace in his quiet moments with the dog. To outsiders, it might look like he was the one helping the dog, but no one would ever know just how much the dog was helping him too. There was no way he could ever tell Molly that he was feeding a street dog, though. He knew she hated pets and had a particular disdain for the many dogs that littered the streets of Mendoza. Now, though, Molly had noticed the dog was hanging around too much. Part of Joe hoped that if he had just admitted that he was taking care of the dog, she'd have left him alone. But after 6 years of marriage, he really should have known better. Molly had put 2 and 2 together and realized why the dog was always around the house, and she definitely wasn't happy about it. Joe tried to assure her that the dog hadn't actually been inside the house and that she didn't need to have anything to do with it, but the angry woman just wasn't willing to listen. She told her husband that if she ever saw the dog again, she wouldn't be held responsible for her actions. Joe was deeply shocked. Molly was a lot of things, but surely she'd never purposely hurt an animal. Would she? The kind man couldn't bear the thought, but then again, he could not see the dog ever again. If he stopped feeding it, then it would probably end up just as skinny as it was when he first saw it, if not worse. It was no good. The dog had become the only bit of light and happiness in his life, and he couldn't see it suffering. He wouldn't be ordered around by Molly anymore. He just needed to make sure the dog was well out of the way when Molly returned home from work. For a few weeks, Joe's plan worked. He had the luxury of working from home, so he could switch up the feeding times and make sure the dog wasn't hanging around when Molly came home. Thankfully, her schedule was pretty regular, so she returned home at around the same time every day. But a new problem was starting to develop. The dog had become a lot more used to Joe and was now very friendly. Joe loved that the dog had come to trust him, but it now meant that the poor animal was reluctant to ever stray too far away from the house. Whenever he saw Joe, the dog would furiously wag his tail in delight and then flop over for belly rubs. It made Joe laugh, but deep down, he still had a niggling feeling that if Molly found out, she'd do something unspeakable. Sadly, he was about to find this out sooner rather than later. Molly stormed out of work. Her bad attitude wasn't something she reserved just for her husband. She had just had a run-in with her line manager over the way she spoke to people. However, in Molly's mind, it was never her fault. Someone else was always to blame. She threw her bags in the car and slumped into the seat, slamming her fist on the steering wheel. She swore that if that mangy dog was hanging around the house again, there'd be hell to pay. Her husband thought that she didn't know he was still feeding it, but at least he had the sense to make sure it was long gone when she got home. Something inside Molly told her she needed a little plan of her own. Instead of heading home, she took a detour to the nearest pet store and picked up a leash, jamming it into her glove compartment with the feeling that she would need it sooner than later. She had no idea just how soon she'd be using it. Arriving home, Molly couldn't tell if she was pleased or disappointed to see that the dog wasn't around. Joe would normally be busy cleaning or cooking in some sort of attempt to get her in good books, but he was nowhere to be seen. It quickly became apparent why. When Molly stepped into the kitchen, she saw Joe out in the garden. And worst of all, the awful street dog was rolling around in front of him. Both her husband and the dog were oblivious to her, so when the dog casually cocked his leg and used Molly's flower bed as his bathroom, the woman saw red. Her plan would need to be executed sooner than she thought. Her stupid husband and the awful dog were about to learn a lesson. Grabbing the leash out of the car, Molly swiftly made her way around to the back garden. When Joe spotted her, he glanced at his watch and his face dropped. He'd been having so much fun playing with the dog that he completely lost track of the time, and now his wife was home. What he couldn't quite work out was why she was carrying a dog leash. Before he could even defend himself or the dog, the angry woman looped the leash around the dog's neck and sharply pulled it. Joe tried to scramble to his feet, but he'd been sat down for so long his foot had gone numb. By the time he caught up with his wife, he felt sick at what he was witnessing. Molly had tied the poor dog to the car and was about to put the key in the ignition. Surely, she wouldn't drive with the dog tied up like that, would she? Joe struggled to comprehend that his wife could be so evil. The devastated man began to shout, but it was too late. Molly's engine rumbled, and she slammed her foot down on the pedal, screeching down the road at high speed. The poor dog had no choice but to try and run. Joe's heart sank as bile rose up in his throat. With not a second to lose, he dug his own car keys out of his pocket and set off after the evil woman. By now, Molly had made it to the high street. She'd not once looked back at the dog, though she could tell it was still tied to the car. Rage and a deep-seated evilness blinded her as she continued down the busy street at high speed. By now, people were shouting and screaming at her, but she no longer cared. The dumb dog and her husband needed to be taught a lesson. People were now attempting to stop the car, but she was going too fast for them to do anything. Some people were filming the situation in the hopes that the police could use the footage against her. There was a feeling of helplessness amongst everyone who was watching the terrible scene unfold. The poor dog's situation was not for the faint of heart. Suddenly, Joe swerved around the corner. He'd gone in the opposite direction to Molly, hoping to cut her off, and thankfully his plan worked. He saw her car speeding down the high street. Luckily, the dog was still running along, but Joe could tell it wasn't in a good way. He pulled across the road and slammed on his brakes as Molly careered towards him. For a moment, Joe doubted she would stop, and he braced himself, but just inches from his door, his evil wife's car came to a screeching stop. Joe had never moved so fast. He jumped out of his car and ran to the back of Molly's vehicle. The poor dog was now lying on the floor, but the kind man could see the poor animal was at least still breathing. He quickly unfastened the leash and gently slipped the loop from around his beloved companion's neck. He carefully placed the dog's head in his lap as tears rolled down his cheeks. Even in its pain and confusion, the loving dog gently wagged its tail at Joe's touch. After all his wife had put it through, the gentle giant still wanted to be with him. Joe's heart shattered at the dog's loyalty. If only he had taken his wife's threat seriously and kept a closer eye on the time. The poor animal wouldn't be in this situation. He couldn't help but blame himself for the devastating injuries his new friend had sustained at the hands of his evil wife. Thankfully, Molly was about to get exactly what she deserved for her cruel act. The police had arrived on the scene, and with a whole host of eyewitnesses and video evidence to back up their testimonies, there was no way Molly could even try and deny what she had done. She was swiftly arrested and taken in for questioning before being charged with several offenses, including dangerous driving and the cruel act against the dog. The only response the cold-hearted woman gave was that she was teaching the dog a lesson. Back at the devastating scene, a local veterinarian had thankfully been in the area, and he offered to take the poor dog back to his surgery. Joe couldn't thank the man enough and said silent prayers the whole way there that the dog would be okay. If the poor animal somehow managed to pull through, he knew exactly what he wanted to happen. There was no question that he would be filing for divorce from Molly and finding his own place to live with the dog. He thought it was the least he could do for the animal. The veterinarian carefully cleaned the dog's injuries and carried out a gentle examination. All the while, Joe stood close by, tears threatening to fall once again. Every time the dog looked at Joe, he wagged his tail. A little glimmer of happiness still lived on in the poor animal. It was as if he wanted to let the devastated man know that it wasn't his fault, and he still loved him. By some miracle, the vet concluded that the brave dog hadn't sustained any injuries that he wouldn't fully recover from in time. Joe couldn't believe it. He feared the worst, and somehow his gentle friend had withstood the horrific act of Molly. After a thorough investigation and trial, Molly was sent to prison for what she'd done to the dog. The whole community was outraged at the evil woman and was glad to see justice had been served. Within hours of the footage being shared, Molly had already lost her job at the school, well before there was even any talk of being sent to prison. If she'd somehow avoided prison, the school wanted nothing to do with someone who could be so evil. In her first few weeks locked up, the only posts she received were divorce papers from Joe. He'd finally had the tennis to do what he should have done a long time ago. He still felt guilty for what had happened to the poor dog and wanted nothing more to do with Molly. In time, the dog did heal, and Joe wasted no time in bringing his best friend home. He named the dog Tennis not only for the strength it had shown all through its life, but for the courage and bravery it had given Joe to finally live a happy life. Tennis was the happiest he'd ever been, spending his days going on long walks and having all the belly tickles and food he wanted. Before they met, Joe and Tennis had been lonely and miserable, but now they had each other and life had never been better. What an incredible story! If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. See you in the next video.